Hello, I'm Patrick Reynolds, and welcome to the first episode of Cinema History Reviews. In this series, I'll be reviewing movies and television shows that use real history for their inspiration or setting. I plan to provide some historical context and examine the choices that get made when adapting historical source material. I'll be looking at what parts of history the creators decide to include, what they decide to alter, and what gets ignored outright. For my first review, I picked a movie that's pretty well known and pretty well liked, and that is Gladiator, directed by Ridley Scott. Gladiator came out in the year 2000, and this movie made a ton of money. It won 5 Oscars. It was successful enough, really, to revive the entire genre of the swords and sandals epic. This movie paved the way for later movies like 300 or Troy, and also for some TV shows like HBO's Rome or Spartacus on Starz. Gladiator is sort of fascinating because there's just so much history that it gets wrong and so much that it gets right.
My history's a little hazy.
Yeah.
Are you not entertained?
Yeah! So, Gladiator did pop up on Netflix recently, and at the moment it is pretty easily accessible. So if you haven't managed to see it in the last 14 years, be warned, there are spoilers coming up. So the movie starts us off with our main character Maximus, played by Russell Crowe. And Maximus is a fictional character, but he is sort of a combination of several real Romans who lived in really different time periods and played very different roles in society. So it's a little weird to see them mushed together. But when we're first introduced to him, he's shown to be a great general and leader, and he's called upon to save Rome in her hour of need, and he doesn't want to. He just wants to go home with his family and his farm, but he nobly accepts the duty anyway. And that is the exact description of Cincinnatus, who's a real Roman general and statesman who lived about 700 years before this movie is set. And Cincinnatus was really important to the Romans. He was viewed in the same sort of way that a lot of modern Americans view George Washington. So setting up the character of Maximus with a lot of the same traits as Cincinnatus makes him both easily acceptable as someone who's admirable to the Romans and also is pretty admirable to modern Americans who might be watching this. As the name of the movie might suggest, Maximus eventually becomes a gladiator around the middle part of the movie, and as a gladiator he defies the Roman state and he recruits some gladiator buddies into defying it with him. And this is similar to the story about Spartacus, who was a real person from about 300 years before this movie is supposed to take place. And we're getting a little bit closer. I won't talk too much about Spartacus, though, because he does have his own full movie, and he also has his own TV series. So we'll talk more in detail about Spartacus in a later review. Maximus is also partly based on a guy named Narcissus, who just had the one name like Cher. And Narcissus was a wrestler and a gladiator trainer to Emperor Commodus, and he does eventually kill Commodus, not by stabbing him in the amphitheater like in this movie, but by strangling him in the bathtub. And Narcissus was originally Maximus's name in early versions of the script, but it was changed at some point, and I think that's probably a good thing because it's just not a name that you can make sound intimidating.
You will remove your helmet and tell me your name.
My name is
Narcissus. So, while Maximus was a fictional character cobbled together from a couple different people, the antagonist of this film, Emperor Commodus, was a real person, and the film changed a number of things about him, but Joaquin Phoenix's portrayal is pretty great. The things they changed were factual things, both big and small. The real Emperor Commodus was left-handed, for example. He also ruled for 20 years instead of like a year-ish, like in this movie. But he was, as it depicted in the movie, emotional and just sort of impulsive and full of crazy. He did think he was a gladiator in real life and would often go into the arena fighting rigged matches against people who couldn't really fight back. He'd tie people together and pretend they were giants, and then he'd kill them in front of the senators. Crazy guy, not a good emperor, so his performance, Joaquin Phoenix's performance, is very enjoyable and very intense, and you get the essence of who Commodus was and why he was a bad leader. Another important character in this movie is Lucilla, who was also a real person. She was the sister of Emperor Commodus, and in real life, she schemed and plotted against him, trying to overthrow him in favor of getting more power for her husband. she failed in real life and was executed, and in the movie, the character of Lucilla just kind of goes back and forth between wanting to support Maximus and being forced into supporting Commodus. And she is the only female character in this movie who gets any lines, which is disappointing. Um, and her depiction is in line with a very common depiction of powerful Roman women in our modern media, and that is the Roman woman as a corrupt, callous backstabber and political operator. And Rome itself was an overwhelmingly sexist and patriarchal society. Women who achieved any form of political power at the high levels in ancient Rome tended to be backstabbers or manipulators of a pretty high degree, as would the men who tended to gain power in these societies. But since women were not expected to be there by the Roman society and their norms, they tended to be very demonized if they did wield power by the historians writing about them. So you see people like Cleopatra and Livia and Agrippina and, again, Lucilla depicted usually very negatively. Um, and I like that Gladiator at least depicts Lucilla sympathetically, as compared to a lot of other works. And Lucilla is clearly shown in this movie to not enjoy the backstabbing and the manipulating that she's very good at, but having been forced into it by the political realities that she lives in. And just very regretful about all the things she has to do in order to survive, but still willing to do them. And that's a decent portrayal, I think. But as much as I want to continue ranting about historical Roman sexism and the good and bad ways that the depictions of Roman women in history are being translated onto modern media, that'll be a very long talk, and when I review the HBO series Rome, I'll have a lot more to talk about on that front. So I'll save the very long discussion for that review and proceed on to the plot. So one of the central conflicts that drives the story is the conflict between Emperor Commodus, who wants to get rid of the Senate for some reason, and the Senate, who's trying to restore the Republic and convince Maximus to help them do that. And this is massively anachronistic, considering what time period it's supposed to take place in. Emperor Commodus comes to power at the end of what's called now the era of the Five Good Emperors. And as you might imagine, those five good emperors were fairly good, and the imperial power was very, very strongly vested in the person of the emperor. And the Senate was pretty vestigial at that point. There would really be no question of removing the Senate because they were generally not seen as any sort of threat to the emperor. And there was really no question of the Senate trying to restore the Republic because they were so weak, there really was no chance. The conflict between Republic and Empire, though, is something about Roman history that most viewers are probably more familiar with than the struggles that were going on during the time of Commodus's lifetime, which historically it really would have been a struggle for who would be the emperor, not should there be an emperor. The struggle between Republic and Emperor really was about 200 years before this movie takes place, the time period of Julius Caesar and Augustus and Mark Antony were fairly well known when it comes to ancient Romans. And even the military in the beginning of this movie is about 200 years off in terms of the equipment, the armor, and the weapons that they're wielding. And they're very similar to what sort of armies you'd see working to fight the civil wars for Julius Caesar against the Senate. And essentially it's just a way to start the conflict between Maximus and Commodus that the movie really revolves around, using a setup that's already familiar to the audience for the most part. As silly as it is, as anachronistic as it is, I kind of forgive it because of the ending, which is my absolute favorite part for reasons that are probably kind of weird. The ending of this movie actually really wraps it up well and puts the silly Republic versus Empire anachronism debate at an end point that is right where Roman politics were at when Commodus dies. It wraps it all up quite neatly. So let's take a look at a little bit of this final scene, and I'll point out why I like it so much, just for history reasons.
Quintus, sword! Give me your sword! Sword! Give me a sword!
Sheathe your sword!
Sheathe your sword!
So these guys, those are the Praetorian Guards, and they're probably my favorite part of this whole movie. The Praetorian Guards, for those of you who are not familiar, are essentially the Emperor's bodyguards. And in this movie, they fulfill the role of guarding him, doing his evil bidding, generally serving the role of elite mooks. But at the end, when he's about to get murdered and he could really use some bodyguards, they just kind of stop bodyguarding him and let Maximus do his thing. And that's actually pretty much exactly accurate to how the Praetorian Guard operated. The actual assassination of Commodus by Narcissus when he was strangled in the bathtub, the Praetorian Guards just stopped guarding him and let Narcissus do their dirty work. The Praetorian Guards, around the time of Emperor Caligula, quite a bit before this movie takes place, realized that since their job is standing around with weapons near the Emperor all day, that if they didn't like the Emperor, they could just stab him and get a new one. And immediately after the death of Commodus, the Praetorian Guard take this to the extreme. Watch this clip right here and keep your eye on Quintus and the Praetorians, and not on Maximus making his glorious proclamations.
Free my men. Senator Gracchus is to be reinstated. There was a dream that was Rome. It shall be realized. These are the wishes of Marcus Aurelius.
Free the prisoners! Go!
So if you'll notice, while Maximus is issuing his orders and trying to wrap up the Empire versus Republic plot, the Praetorians don't listen to him at all. They don't move a muscle until their commander gives them the go-ahead. It's pretty clear that whatever Maximus wants, it's up to these guys to carry it out, and they're under the control of Quintus there. What happens in real life after the assassination of Commodus is that the Praetorians pretty much immediately just pick a new guy to be emperor, and about 2 months later, he starts trying to give them orders that they don't like, so they kill him. And then after that, they actually hold an auction where they just take bids for who wants to be the next emperor. And the winner of that auction is actually killed about 2 or 3 months after he becomes emperor. So it sets off a pretty large chain of chaos that continues for a while in ancient Rome, as people just start killing each other, armies start getting involved, generals start promoting themselves as emperors, and the Praetorians just kind of assassinate a lot of them. So the Republic dream that was Rome, that Maximus keeps going on about, it's not going to happen, buddy. That dream's dead by the time the credits roll. So that's Gladiator. It's a big, glorious mess. It's an anachronism stew. It's weird. It's silly, it's badass, it's intense, it's emotional, and it's just a lot of fun to watch. And again, it did open the door for a lot of other historical epics that followed in its footsteps, some of them good, some of them not as good. And we'll probably take a look at a few of those in the series as well. Thank you very much for watching my first film review here, and if you have any comments or suggestions about what I should review next, please let me know. Send me a message, and I'll definitely read that and try and get back to you if I can.